Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Great to be here with you this morning. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We have the opportunity to learn from really an incredible set of events in Jesus' life and a brilliant passage of Scripture telling us about them. If you have your Mark journal with you, you can take that out. It's a great place to take some notes as we go along. We're going to continue to learn this story as our series and in this journal has been explaining to us a story of Jesus that fulfills the Scriptures of the Old Testament and tells us about the events of his life and tells us that work, that good news work of Jesus was only just beginning and continues on in our own lives. Today's story is a story about the incredible power and hope of Jesus and about some followers of Jesus who are like us in many ways. Some followers of Jesus who over the course of this story, I think they entered the story exhausted and weary and pushed to their limits and beyond. They were worn out, beat up, and run down, and then Jesus pushed them beyond their limits, and they were exhausted for the simple crime of doing exactly what Jesus asked them to do. Ever felt that way? Let's talk about the experience of the disciples here. At the beginning of the story, it says that they came and they told Jesus all that they had done and taught. And you might wonder what was going on. Earlier in Mark chapter 6, Jesus had been himself ministering from town to town, traveling from village to village, and then he commissioned these 12 of his closest disciples and sent them out that they would basically do the same thing. He raised them up as leaders, deputized and commissioned them, and they went out and cast out evil spirits, stood against evil in their world, taught about the kingdom of God, and preached that people should turn to Jesus. And they came back and told Jesus about all that they had done. They'd probably traveled around, they'd stayed in strange homes, they depended on the generosity of others, they had given everything they had and then some, and they came back. And Jesus saw that they had given everything that they had, and he saw that the crowds were large, the demand was great. Have you ever been given a task that just there was no end, there was still more, all that you could do and more was needed? He said the crowd was still there, and the crowd was so great, they didn't even have time to eat. Some of us have literally felt that way at some times. We've been so busy, the task has been so great, the children so demanding, I don't know, something like that we didn't even have time to eat ourselves. And Jesus says, come away with me to a quiet place by yourselves. Let's get some rest. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that probably very few of us have been asked by Jesus to go from town to town on the north end of the Sea of Galilee among all those villages, casting out evil spirits and teaching the kingdom. That maybe was not your specific assignment from Jesus as it was for them. But we have been, all of us, sent and assigned by Jesus to different tasks in his creation, in his world. It can be the vocation, the calling is the word for it, the professions, the workplaces where God sends you to do fruitful work in his world. It could be in our homes, in our relationships. Maybe I joked about kids earlier, if you're a parent. Maybe in your neighborhoods or friend groups, maybe in ministry that you participate in, maybe something that you have created for the good of the world around you, maybe something you share in here at church. There are all kinds of places that God sends us, all kinds of ways that he assigns us to serve in his kingdom, as God did from the very beginning. In the vocation class, the work class that just ended that Aaron was teaching, he had a phrase that I hadn't heard before. He said, we read from the creation story, one of the first things God gave human beings was a job description, something to do, right? To take care of the garden, to fill the earth and subdue it. Jesus gives us assignments that take us usually up to our limits and oftentimes beyond them. And then Jesus responds in compassion. Come on, let's not do that all the time. There needs to be rest. Come away with me. Let's refill to a quiet place. The disciples get in the boat. They go with Jesus to a deserted place, to a solitary place. But the need was so great. Apparently what they were doing was so valuable, the crowds ran from all the towns around and got there ahead of them, right? Please, sir, can I have some more? Yes, okay. The beatings will continue until morale improves. And they get across the lake and they see these crowds. And Jesus has compassion on them. And I love this. One of the things that Jesus does in his compassion is to teach them all day long. Get ready, everybody. Just kidding, not all day long. He begins to teach them many things because he understood what they needed to know what God was doing. They had been taught already, but perhaps not well. So Jesus taught them all day long. And at the end of the day, I think his own disciples also, maybe they had a different attitude. I don't know. The Bible doesn't always tell us what the tone of voice was or what the attitude was. But the disciples, I think, responded in empathy. They knew what it was like not to be able even to eat because there was so much going on. And so they said to Jesus, it's been all day, it's getting late, you should dismiss the crowd, right? Let them go to the nearby towns and villages, we're out here in the wilderness, and let them go buy some bread, some food to eat. And then Jesus says to these disciples who came back so full of all that they had done and so busy that they couldn't even eat, and then they got in the boat to go to a solitary place, and then they got busy again all day long, and he says to them, you give them something to eat. Like, seriously? Jesus is discipling the disciples, I think, by pushing them up to and even beyond their limits. And they say very reasonably, this is beyond our resources. I don't have the capacity for this. What are we supposed to do? Buy enough bread for thousands of people? And then Jesus says, how much do you have? And then I love this. Go and look. Like, don't just assume. I want you to dig deep. I want you to find out everything you've got. And I don't think it probably took that long because among the 12 of them, they were like 5 loaves. That's what we've got. Also, we found 2 fish. I wonder if they had them or they found them dead on the lakeside. I don't know what the 2 fish, but 5 loaves and also 2 fish. And then Jesus takes what they offer and in his miraculous abundant provision turns that into more than enough. He has the people sit down in groups. It echoes some Old Testament passages probably from the Exodus and wilderness journey. And then there's more than enough. They pick up the pieces that were left over, 12 basketfuls, a sign of his abundant provision, probably reflecting the calling of 12 disciples, like the 12 tribes of Israel, reflecting God's intention to restore all of his people. And then after that, he says, get back in the boat, go back to Bethsaida. That's basically the area where they were before. Go back across the lake. Jesus stays, dismisses the crowd. He gets to be alone for a while. He prays to the Father. And then the disciples are in the boat on the lake rowing against a terrible storm. If you've ever been in Israel, you may have been there to the Sea of Galilee. From the east side to the west side, it's big, but you can see across it. It's not that big. It's not an ocean. It's not one of the Great Lakes. But the storm is so severe that even in a moderately sized body of water, they can't. They're straining at the oars. Jesus comes to them at the end of the night. Literally, it says in the 4th watch, 12 hours of night divided into 4 equal parts of 3 hours each. They've been going all night long, and they can't get across. And Jesus comes walking across the water, passing them by. We'll get back to that strange note in a second. And they don't recognize him. All right? They don't recognize that Jesus is there in the midst of their hardship. Anybody? They don't recognize him right there in the middle of it. And in fact, they're scared. They think it's something else. They think it's a ghost. And they cry out. And then he says, don't be afraid. Take heart. It's me. Literally, I am. If you've ever heard that in the Bible before. It's me. I am. Ego eimi. I am. And then he gets in the boat and the story's over. Except that it says they still didn't understand. They still didn't understand. I can't help but wondering if one of the things as they get to the end of themselves one time, and Jesus wants to go give them some rest. They get to the end of themselves again, and Jesus says, give them something to eat. From what? And then he puts them out, and it's Jesus again who puts them out on the water for a storm that they're not enough that they can't handle, and he joins them, and things calm down again. In all of their exhaustion here, I can't help but wonder if one of the deepest sources of deepest exhaustion is how they missed who and where Jesus really was among them. Even walking across the water, they just didn't even know that it was him. And the story that Mark tells us gives us clues about this kind of gradually. So I think that we as readers might have the same experience that the disciples had, coming gradually to terms, coming gradually to realize, oh my, the very presence of God is here with me in the places where I don't have enough on my own. Let me try to explain some of this passage to show you what I mean by that. A couple chapters earlier, actually, there's another kind of calming sea moment when Jesus calms the storm. He'd been in the boat with them, and the disciples at the end of that go, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Let's take that question that the disciples are coming to terms with. Who is this Jesus? And the first clue that Mark gives us is this miraculous provision of bread in the wilderness. In each of these elements of the story, he's echoing stories or passages from the Old Testament. The miraculous provision of bread in the wilderness. Any Israelite at all in Jesus' day, anybody who had read their Torah, their Bible, their Old Testament, they wouldn't have called it that yet, at all, would remember the provision of manna in the wilderness when the Israelites were starving, they were at the end of themselves, they weren't going to have enough, and God miraculously provided for them. And these disciples might have begun to wonder, how is that possible? Who's providing bread for us? And it might, on the one hand, seem that Jesus is a powerful human being, a miracle worker, a wonder worker. Moses might be seen to have done some things like this. And yet it wasn't really Moses. In fact, Jesus explains this in John chapter 6. It wasn't just Moses who gave you bread in the wilderness, but it is my Father in heaven. It is ultimately God who provides you the real bread that you need, who would provide more than enough and gather all 12 tribes of his people and gather all 12 again. There's a clue there. You wonder, is something more going on here than Jesus just being an incredible human leader? And then there are these interesting references, descriptions in the story of Jesus walking on the water. And the words that Mark uses are quotations of, allusions to, echoes of a passage in Job chapter 9. Now, let me read you. These are actually the words that Job uses to describe God. In Job chapter 9, verses 8 through 11, I'll read part of it and then finish it. Job says, God alone stretches out the heavens, and he alone treads on the waves of the sea. Who is this that will be walking across the water? God alone does that. He's the maker of the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades and the constellations. He stretches out the stars in the sky. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. I'm going to hold off one verse here for a second. And then it says in the story of Jesus walking on the water, he was about to pass them by. Now, I have to tell you, Bible readers and commentators in this passage from like thousands of years ago, stretching back to St. Augustine, have all tried to make sense of that passage. What exactly was Jesus doing there? There are a couple of Old Testament passages that describe God this way. One is a story, again, from the Exodus, of God passing by Moses, and Moses looking and seeing God as God has passed by. Is a revelation of God. And there's another one, and what's interesting to me is it comes from the very same passage in Job, as Job trampling upon as God trampling upon the waves of the water. The next verse of that passage is, he passes me by, I cannot see him. When he passes by, I cannot perceive him. Which is exactly the situation the disciples were in. Jesus is about to pass them by, and then even when he gets in the boat, they still don't understand. They didn't understand the loaves. They thought he was a ghost. Their hearts were hardened. He didn't perceive it. I think Mark is bringing us along, leaving us the clues to come to terms with the truth of who Jesus is. And then, when Jesus finally, they're scared, and he cries out to them, and he says, don't be afraid, take heart, I am. The translation uses it is I, which makes sense in the story. But he uses the exact words, again, from the Exodus story in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, when Moses is being sent by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt into the wilderness to the promised land. And Moses says, who shall I tell them has sent me? And God says, tell them I am has sent you. That's my name, I am. Why would Mark kind of just leave these clues? Why would he tell it this way and not just give us the language that Christians developed a couple hundred years later in the Nicene Creed to say Jesus is of one being with the Father, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made? Why wouldn't he just spell it all out that way? I think one reason is to allow us to have the same experience of coming to this knowledge in the way that the disciples did, the way history tells us Mark learned these stories from Peter. Peter would have been in that boat, uncomprehending like the rest, and Mark is giving us that experience. I think it's also a way that we learn things more deeply and substantially than just single slogans, phrases, blatant statements of the truth. Some things are so deep and powerful that when you put them into words, they feel less deep and powerful. Have you ever had the struggle of knowing something, experiencing something, feeling something, and telling it to somebody else, and like, yeah, they get it, but they also don't get it? It's hard to say it as big as it is. There's a poem that I brought along that I want to read to you. This is a poem. I don't know if y'all like poetry or not, and if you don't, that's okay. This won't be on the final. But this is a poem by Emily Dickinson, and it's about what happens when we encounter dazzling truth and how we take it in. The poem is called Tell It Slant. And this is what she says in about 8 lines. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Sometimes we come to appreciate, understand, appreciate, and acquire the truth in a more powerful way when we're brought to wrestle with it and put the pieces together. And I think Mark wants us to wrestle with and appreciate the otherwise, honestly, mind-bending, mind-blowing truth that the creator of heaven and earth has somehow walked among us as a human being. And if we can encounter that incredible truth, then what will we learn from this story that God is doing among us in the person of Jesus? In his compassion for his disciples, for the crowds, and for us, what's he doing? The first one might be a little bit counterintuitive. He's sharing his work with them. He's sharing his work with us. Do you remember a couple weeks ago, a little slogan from the sermon that Aaron gave here and I gave at Lytham Road? When the kingdom comes, the curse is reversed. That humanity is restored. Creation is restored. We were given work to do in God's world from the very beginning, and it gives us purpose and meaning and joy, and it's part of our humanity. Jesus, again, is sharing his work with us to do in the world. It could be all kinds of different assignments, all kinds of different environments that God has placed you in, and there's a very good chance that at one time or another, that work has been too hard. It has brought you into suffering. It has brought you to the end of yourself. It might be hard. It might push you up to and beyond your limits, and it might be that that's exactly the point. When I think about the experiences of my life, I can think right off the top of my head of 3 to 5 or more moments in my work as a pastor, in my assignment as a husband and as a father, that it has been when I have gotten all the way up to the end of myself and past, when God has done his best work in my heart, when I have learned the most important lessons in my life, when I have been brought to the end of my capacity and say, God, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here anymore, that all of a sudden it gets clearer, that I get new direction. I'm like, oh, I was trying so hard to feed 5,000 people out of my stupid 5 loaves, and it's not working. But you can do it by your power and in your way. Maybe you've been there in the assignment that God has given you, and it has brought you up to your limit, and it has brought you past. And finally, when you will go, I've only got 5, what do you want from me? I'm straining against the oars all night long. I'm a quarter of a mile from this shore and still 6 miles from that shore. How are we going to get there? And then Jesus goes, take heart. Don't be afraid. Have courage. I am. And gets into the boat with us and calms the storm and gives us direction. He shares his work with us. He gives us our work back to do again, which is already an act of incredible forgiveness, is it not? It takes grace. It does with me. It takes grace to encounter the foolishness and the self-direction and the wrong-headedness that I often bring to the table, and Jesus to go, I forgive you, and now do it my way. I'm going to send you back in. I'm going to put you back on the court. I'll put you back on the field again. He shares his work with us, and he promises to provide enough. He completes the work by his grace and by his power. You know what it never depends on in this story? It never depends on the resources or strength or abilities of the disciples, does it? I mean, he gives them work to do. He gives you work to do. He gives me work to do. It's how he created us. It's one of the joys of our lives. And yet, we're never enough on our own. The feeding of the 5,000 or the 10,000, how many people were actually out there all together? They didn't do it with their loaves. You guys, it doesn't depend on you having enough loaves. It's not based on our resources. Doesn't depend on your strength. You strain at the oars all night long. Work as hard as Jesus calls you to work. You'll make as much progress as you make, and you won't get all the way there. Doesn't depend on our strength or power. Thanks be to God. Doesn't even depend on the clarity of their faith or comprehension. They got everything wrong most of the way through the story. Even when Jesus walked across the water to them, they were still like, I think it's a ghost. doesn't depend on us having all the right answers and getting it all together. Jesus is the one who fulfills his promises. He's the one who brings his kingdom among us. He's the one who brings grace and power and goodness. I want to finish by leaving you with two words, one that I encountered in an unexpected context this week, and one from another passage from the Old Testament. Here's the first thing. I was making notes on this passage and preparing for today in the blank pages at the end of a calendar or planner book that I have. And that's sometimes where I make my notes. I have it along with me. And it's like many planners, it has little inspirational sayings sprinkled throughout so that, you keep your spirits up and they sell more planners and whatever. So at the top of the page, I encountered this little inspirational saying. No one else can grant you a fulfilling life. You are the author of your own story. So divide your day into 4 blocks of 3 hours and figure out what your goals are. And, oh, look, you have a planner too. Okay. Up to a point, that's honestly not bad advice, right? The things that have happened to you in life don't define your story. Your circumstances don't define your story. You can't depend on other people to figure everything out for you. You've got work to do, right? Okay, that's great. But if that's the good news, there's a real ceiling on it. No one else can grant you a fulfilling life. You better figure it out. You are the author of your own story. Don't screw it up. That's not great news for me. I don't know about you. And so in my planner, and I would have taken a picture of my specific planner, but my handwriting is chicken scratch and it wouldn't have helped you. So Becky Bork, one of our teammates who happens to use the same calendar that I do, I asked her if she would write this out. So that's Becky's handwriting. So this is what I wrote in my own planner. Jesus will grant you a fulfilling life. He is the author of your own story. Jesus can and Jesus will, and he is the author of your story, and he will make good on his promises. Let me leave you with God's own word on that. This comes from the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 34. Do you remember how Jesus got out of the boat and he looked at the crowds and he saw the problem? They were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, that's a cool image, but Jesus didn't make it up, actually. That's a line you can find in many places in the Old Testament. A lot of the prophets and others indicted Israel's leaders, their priests and their government and their rulers, for being bad shepherds for the people. And sometimes there's the hope that God will send a new shepherd, a Messiah, a king. In some ways, Jesus does fulfill that promise. But it's not all there is. There's another passage that comes from Ezekiel chapter 34. I'd commend to you the whole chapter if you want to read it, but I'm going to read you a few verses. I'll skip around a little bit, starting at verse 11, when God says, I'm going to send you a new shepherd, but actually, I'll be the shepherd. And this is what he says. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. Maybe you feel like the sheep that are scattered on every hillside, those that are beat up and worn down and need to be gathered. Maybe in another way, we've also been given shepherding tasks, and we haven't been all the kind of shepherd that God intends for us to be. And he forgives us, and he restores us, and he gives us the work back. He says, I will do it. I'm the one who will create justice in this earth. I'm the one who will restore my people. I'm the one who will provide more than enough. And that, I think, is our hope, and that, I think, is a source of strength, and that, I think, is the courage that we have. When this service is over, when you go home, when you go back to work or back to whatever it is tomorrow, and you go back to the place that pushes you beyond your limits, that's why we have the strength and the courage, the teaching and direction of Jesus to go back into those places and work by the strength and at the direction of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Let me pray for God's ongoing work in us and through us. Lord Jesus, we trust that, in fact, you are our shepherd. You are the one who gathers us when we're the people who are sheep without a shepherd. And we've been pushed beyond our limits. And then you allow us to participate even in your own work also. And I pray, Jesus, that you would get us more easily to that place. That maybe we wouldn't have to fight you so hard and struggle so hard before we come to the end of ourselves. But I pray that by the presence of your Spirit, by the generosity of your grace, you would bind us up, that you would heal us and nourish us and cause us to lie down in green pastures. and that you would empower our serving and give us joy in it. For we come before you and pray in your own name. Amen.